Hello and welcome. You're watching Gravitas. I'm Molly Gambhir. Let's get started. What is the first thing that comes to your mind when I say Russia? Well, one thing is for sure, protests do not. It is rare for Russia and domestic protests to figure in the same sentence. Expression of dissent, opposition is extremely rare in Russia, and which is why what has unfolded over the last 24 hours in the country has far-reaching implications. Russians are protesting against Vladimir Putin. Let that sink in. What are they opposing? The Russian leader's partial mobilization plan for the war in Ukraine. Putin wants Russians to give up their lives for the Ukraine cause, and these protests on the ground in Russia are a sign of how Russia could be losing domestic support for that war in Ukraine. Vladimir Putin has a serious problem to deal with.
Идите ко мне, иди, братуха, иди, идите сюда, иди. Он доблестный.
The backlash has started. Yesterday, we told you about Vladimir Putin's plans, a partial mobilization. Russian citizens are being told to give up their lives, pick up arms, and head to the battlefield. But the move is not going down well with the people of Russia. Massive protests have broken out. Just have a look at this. That happened in Moscow, but it was not the only hotspot. Several parts witnessed protests yesterday, from St. Petersburg to other parts. There were reports of protests from at least 38 Russian cities. Over 1,300 people were detained. This is according to an independent assessment. There is no denying it now. The Kremlin could be losing domestic support for the war in Ukraine. The Russian state is facing a pushback. I have more pictures for you. Have a look at this. No to war. That is their chant. These protesters have another slogan, and this one might not go down well with the Kremlin.
Я не собираюсь убирать за Путина и за вас. Вы сами знаете, что все худово.
I am not going to die for Putin, quote unquote. That is the level of outrage on the ground, and the Kremlin has a serious problem to deal with. These protests are just the tip of the iceberg. A mass exodus is now underway. A large number of Russians are making plans to leave. Soon after Putin's speech, the flights out of Russia started filling up fast. For the next few days, the flights are completely booked. And these are not cheap flights I'm talking about. Tickets for Istanbul and Dubai are among the most sought after. One-way economy ticket. priced as high as 9,200 euros. That is more than $9,000. And let me say that again, this is not a first class or a business class ticket. A ticket to get out of Russia costs well over $9,000. People are panicking. Listen in now to a passenger from Russia.
Still cannot believe all this happened and why this happened. I speak with you and I'm afraid because my government and police can see it and I will have problem in my country. But I want to say freedom for Ukraine. I want to please somebody stop Putin.
That was a passenger in Serbia. Let's now show you what's happening in Turkey. Turkey is bracing for a mass influx. Major carriers flying from Russia are booked till Sunday already. Young Russians are pouring into cities like Istanbul, Izmir and Antalya. Many of them want to somehow get to Europe. Listen in to some of the voices.
Partial mobilization is one of the reasons why I'm here. Very poor step, and seems to be that it can lead to lots of problems to lots of Russian citizens.
Mobilization was inevitable because there was a shortage of human resources. I am not worried because I am already 59 years old and my son lives abroad. That's all, I guess.
Russians are trying to leave through land routes as well. Again, I have pictures for you. This is the Russia-Georgia border. There was a long queue at the checkpoint.
Люди уже на встречку повылазили, кто без очереди, кто стоял уже раньше. Доехать невозможно. Границ.
There were long lines at the Finnish border as well. Remember, Finland has a 1,300-kilometer long border with Russia, and these checkpoints are now among the few ways that Russians can use to escape to Europe. Traffic has now intensified there. Finland is mulling new rules. It could limit or stop Russians from coming into the country. Since the war in Ukraine started, we have discussed various scenarios where the war could spill over into Europe. Well, that is happening now, just not in a way that we would have imagined. More people could try to leave in the coming days. How to leave Russia, quote unquote, was the top Google search trend in the country soon after Putin's speech. The question now is, how will Russia deal with this? A crackdown is certain. Already warnings are being issued. The state prosecutor's office in Moscow has spoken out. It has reminded the people about the punishment for protesting. It could lead to a prison time of 15 years. The Russian state had dealt with anti-war protests with a heavy hand. In the first 6 months of the invasion, over 16,000 people have been arrested. At least 224 people are facing criminal charges. The protesters arrested in the last 24 hours could meet the same fate. But what if these protests get out of hand? What if more people take to the streets? The Russian state might then struggle to keep up. The Russian opposition is speaking out. Putin's arch-rival Alexei Navalny has issued a statement from prison. He is voicing his support for the protesters.
It is now clear that the main thing here is that this crime, this criminal war that is going on, this criminal war of aggression is getting worse and deepening, and that Putin is trying to drag as many people as possible into it all. He wants to smear them in this blood, hundreds of thousands of people, and of course this will lead to huge tragedies, a huge number of deaths, and it certainly cannot and will not lead to anything good.
We have heard similar criticism before, but will such statements deter Vladimir Putin? That is highly unlikely. The Russian president is certainly on the back foot, and Ukraine senses an opportunity here. It has launched a new battle of narratives. The United Nations General Assembly session is underway, where Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky spoke. The recent success in the battlefield has boosted his morale, and Zelensky is now making demands from not just Russia, but from world leaders as well. He wants the UN to create a special war tribunal and punish Russia for the invasion of Ukraine. Zelensky also demanded that Russia should be stripped of its veto powers.
So long as the aggressor is a party to decision-making in the international organization, he must be isolated from them, at least until aggression lasts. Reject the right to vote, deprive delegation rights, remove the right of veto if it is a member of the UN Security Council, in order to punish the aggressor within the institutions.
And Zelensky did not stop there. He shared a plan to end the war as well, a 5-point peace formula to achieve peace and security. Punishment for crimes of aggression, protection of life, restoration of security and territorial integrity, security guarantees, and the determination to defend oneself. That is Zelensky's peace formula. Kiev is making some clear demands. They want Russia to be punished for the war, a return of the territory under Russian control, and security guarantees that make sure that Ukraine is not attacked again. Zelensky made another demand. With these proposals, he told world leaders to ditch neutrality.
Those who speak of neutrality when human values and peace are under attack mean something else. They talk about indifference, everyone for themselves. Here is what they say. They pretend to be interested in each other's problems. They take care of each other formally. They sympathize only for protocol. And that is why they pretend to protect someone, but in reality, they protect only their vested interests.
Basically, Zelensky wants the world to side with Ukraine. That pitch might sound good for a speech, but as Ukraine would have realized during this war, nation states do not operate that way. National interest is at the heart of any diplomatic initiative. While nothing justifies an unprovoked act of aggression, pressure campaigns can only take you so far. Just consider how the Western powers have responded to the war in Ukraine. The US and its allies have imposed severe sanctions on Russia. And how has Moscow responded? By intensifying the war and by mobilizing more troops. Vladimir Putin has now completely changed his rationale behind the war. For the Russian president, the conflict in Ukraine represents a bigger battle between the East and the West. In his recent address, Putin tried to paint Russia as a victim.
In its aggressive anti-Russian policy, the West has crossed every line. We hear constant threats against our country and our people. They are no longer hiding the fact that Russia should be defeated by all means on the battlefield and then deprived of its political, economic, cultural, and in general any kind of sovereignty, with a complete plundering of our country.
Russia is under attack and we need to respond. That is Putin's message. We already know where this is going. The Russian president is mobilizing more troops. That means the fighting will intensify. Only a return to the path of diplomacy and dialogue can reverse this situation. I know what you're thinking. Can Ukraine and Russia end the war through dialogue? Is that even possible? Yes, it is possible. Diplomacy can deliver. Let me show you an example. This happened today. Ukraine and Russia announced a surprise prisoner swap. It involved almost 300 people. About 10 foreigners who fought for Ukraine were also released by Russia.
Hi, it's Gundi, Aidan Aslan and Shock, and we just want to let everyone know that we're now out of the danger zone and we're on our way home to our families and whatnot. Not just us, there was also in total 10 foreigners that were in captivity. We're going to be pretty quiet in regards to media stuff until we get things sorted out and whatnot. We just want everyone to know the good news.
This is the largest prisoner swap since the war started. Countries like Turkey and Saudi Arabia played a role as well. They helped broker the release of the prisoners. That is the kind of diplomacy that can help end hostilities. But global cooperation for any issue is hard to come by these days. And a short while back, India's External Affairs Minister S. Jaishankar spoke. Foreign ministers from all member nations at the UN were discussing the latest developments in Ukraine. S. Jaishankar called for a rapid end to the hostilities. He also demanded an investigation into the alleged war crimes reported in Ukraine. Listen in.
India strongly reiterates the need for an immediate cessation of all hostilities and a return to dialogue and diplomacy. Clearly, as Prime Minister Narendra Modi has emphasized, this cannot be an era of war. Even in conflict situations, there can be no justification for violation of human rights or of international law. Where any such acts occur, it is imperative that they are investigated in an objective and independent manner. This was the position we took with regard to the killings in Bucha, and this is the position we take even today.
Every foreign minister spoke at the platform today, but there will not be a resolution or agreement. Do you know why? Because in its current form, the UN is a toothless body. It is supposed to resolve major global issues, but most of the time, it is deadlocked. Just think about this ongoing session. There are so many issues for the world leaders to discuss. There are wars in Ukraine, Ethiopia, Yemen. There is an unprecedented food crisis, a global cost of living crisis, and not to mention multiple human rights issues. Does the United Nations have a plan to tackle this? The simple answer is no, and the reason is the structure of this organization. The UN General Assembly is basically built on the concept of global democracy. One country, one vote. Vanuatu and Solomon Islands get one vote each. So do the US, China and Russia. Political and military power is irrelevant in the General Assembly. On paper, that is a good thing. Every country must have equal representation. But there was a sinister design behind this setup. You see, the General Assembly may be representative and democratic, but it is also powerless. Case in point being the war in Ukraine. The UN General Assembly has already passed a resolution asking Russia to end the invasion. Has that stopped Vladimir Putin? You know the answer. The fact is, all the power in the UN is concentrated in the Security Council. The General Assembly is like a showpiece, a stage for the world leaders to make the headlines. Their resolutions are non-binding, their condemnations are ignored, and their decisions are in a way swatted aside. Which brings us to the body that does have power, the Security Council, or the Big Boys Club. The victors of World War II declared themselves permanent members of the Council, but after the war, their priorities changed. Today, America and Russia are sworn enemies. So are China and America. As a result, the Council has been split into two camps, the Western camp, America, Britain, France, and the anti-West camp of Russia and China. And to make matters worse, all of them have the veto power, meaning they can kill any proposal in one blow. Does not matter if the entire council is in favor of the resolution, even if one permanent member opposes it, it will be rejected. So that's where the UN stands. A democratic but powerless General Assembly and an undemocratic but powerful Security Council. No wonder the United Nations is failing. Over the years, many countries have tried to make it more representative, India being one of them. India is part of the G4 grouping on United Nations reforms. The other members are Brazil, Germany and Japan. All four of them are seeking a permanent seat at the UN Security Council. It is a noble mission, but here as well there is a drawback. There is no African nation. In fact, 2 continents are completely unrepresented at the Security Council. South America and Africa. That's 1.9 billion people without a seat at the UNSC. The question is, how can the General Assembly fix this gap? How can it step up when the Security Council fails? One attempt was made in 1950 during the Korea War. It was called the Uniting for Peace Resolution. The idea was simple. If the Security Council is deadlocked, the General Assembly must take the initiative. It must give recommendations to the member states. But like I said, these recommendations are non-binding. Members may or may not accept them. The fact is, there is a priority rift between different members of the UNGA. Let's take this session, for example. The West is focused on Russia's war. Africa is focused on food shortages and security. Asia is focused on oil prices and inflation. And the island nations focusing on climate change. All of them are important issues. But the problem is there is no joint effort to solve them. Even when there is political support, the UN has failed. Like the COVID-19 pandemic. Every country was on the same page against the virus, yet there was no global plan. We are still struggling with vaccine inequity, with travel disruptions and with supply chain issues. If a global body cannot solve these global issues, what is the point? So the bottom line is this. The UNGA session has become a glorified ritual. Every year, world leaders dress up and arrive in New York. They make long and dramatic speeches. But in the end, they offer no solutions. Does this mean the UN has become pointless? Perhaps in theory. But a world without the UN would be even worse. Reminds me of what a former UN chief said. The UN was not created to take mankind to heaven, but to save humanity from hell. It may seem like we have achieved neither, but for that we must blame our world leaders. Because let's face it, every captain is only as good as the players. Similarly, every organization is only as good as its members. The so-called global powers must realize this. They must pursue immediate UN reforms. A, expand the Security Council. And B, empower the General Assembly. Because right now, the UNGA is an elaborate exercise of stating the obvious. We know what the problems are. We don't need world leaders to list them out for us. The idea must be to find solutions. And on that front, the UN General Assembly has failed so far. Our next story is about Donald Trump, the former president of the United States. He has been sued for financial fraud. The lawsuit has been filed by Letitia James, the Attorney General of New York. She has accused him of deflating his net worth to avail tax and benefits and minimize his bills. She says he lived a decade of deception through, quote-unquote, art of the steal. What's worse, the charges also involve his 3 adult children. And if convicted, they could all face a 5-year ban from doing business, something that could essentially end the Trump business empire. The Trump family has called these charges politically motivated. But are they? Here's a detailed report.
He left office in 2021, humiliated and disgraced.
A great honor, the honor of a lifetime, the greatest people in the world, and the greatest home in the world. I call it a home.
20 months and a litany of lawsuits later, Donald Trump is still dodging bullets. He faces lawsuits, accusations and investigations. The latest charge involves his family too. 3 of his adult children. 44-year-old Donald Trump Jr., 40-year-old daughter Ivanka Trump, and 38-year-old son Eric Trump. They've all been sued for financial fraud, large-scale illegal activities, and subversion of law. The lawsuit has been filed by Letitia James, the Attorney General of New York. She says the Trump family deflated their net worth to minimize their tax bills. She described it as a decade of deception. Listen to this.
Mr. Trump and the Trump Organization repeatedly and persistently manipulated the value of assets to induce banks to lend money to the Trump Organization on more favorable terms than would otherwise have been available to the company, to pay lower taxes, to satisfy continuing loan agreements, and to induce insurance companies to provide insurance coverage for higher limits and at lower premiums. This conduct was all in violation of Executive Law, Section 6312.
The charges are serious if they get proven by law. The penalties could be lethal and wide-ranging. For starters, Trump may have to pay $250 million in damages. 2, his family could face a 5-year ban on participating in any real estate transactions. 3, his family could get barred from serving as directors of any New York corporation. These restrictions could bring doom to the Trump empire. They could spell the end of his family's many business interests, because this lawsuit will invite more criminal proceedings. Courtesy the New York Attorney General. She also plans to file a criminal referral to federal prosecutors in Manhattan, and a separate tax fraud referral to the Revenue Service, IRS. These referrals will subject the Trump family to a no-holds-barred probe. Here's why.
Claiming you have money that you do not have does not amount to the art of the deal. It's the art of the steal. And there cannot be different rules for different people in this country or in this state. And former presidents are no different. And so today we are making good on that promise, on our commitment. Because no one is above the law.
The lawsuit has rattled Trump. He's calling it a witch hunt, and the lady behind it a racist. In a post on his website, Truth Social, he had this to say about the Attorney General. I never thought this case would be brought up until I saw her really bad poll numbers. She's a fraud who campaigned on a Get Trump platform, despite the fact that the city is one of the crime and murder disasters of the world under her watch. A classic Trump counter. But does it add up? Is the former US president really a victim of a political vendetta? You can't say for sure. In the past, the New York Attorney General, during her various political rallies, has often promised to put Trump in the dock, to put him under pressure from the judiciary. But the thing is, Trump already is under too much pressure. There are a series of trials and probes against him, and various figures in his orbit, at least 19 of them, half of which concern his presidency and revolve around sexual misconduct, election interference, financial irregularities, and inciting an insurrection. These legal cases only worsen Trump's prospects. His chances of evading new lawsuits, be they politically motivated or not. Bureau Report, WION, World is One.
Our next story is from Leicester, a city in the grip of unrest. So much so that the people of the city are afraid to step out of their homes. Where is Leicester? In the heart of England. It is situated in the Midlands and is famous for its cultural diversity. And right now, that diversity seems to be under threat. Courtesy communal clashes. unending violence between members of the Indian and Pakistani diaspora. Throughout September, they have clashed on the streets of Leicester, disrupting the law and order situation, also the daily lives of the city's residents. The first reports came last month on the 28th of August. India defeated Pakistan at the 2022 Asia Cup. The match was followed by minor clashes between fans from the two countries. A lot of them were young men, mostly in their 20s. 4 weeks on, this rivalry has taken a communal color. Have a look at what's playing out. There are reports of attacks on places of worship, targeted vandalism of public properties, and pre-planned protests. On Tuesday night, scores of masked men gathered around a Hindu temple. Their aim was to disrupt a planned religious event. 3 days before that, on the 17th of September, a scuffle was reported between quote-unquote Hindu and Muslim men. This scuffle reportedly left 16 police officers injured. Some reports claiming a police dog was also injured during this. On Twitter, tit-for-tat revenge videos are being posted with the intention of escalating the tensions. People are making hateful comments, trying to flare up the violence. These scuffles are reportedly getting more intense by the day. The scale of arrests and investigations should give you an idea. A total of 47 men have reportedly been arrested so far. The police say some of them had come from outside the city. They planned and organized fights against each other. The Indian High Commission has taken note of these incidents. It has condemned the targeted violence and vandalization of religious symbols. It says, and I'm quoting now, "We have strongly taken up this matter with the UK authorities and have sought immediate action against those involved in these attacks." Remember, the Midlands, where Leicester is located, has for a long time been home to members of various religious groups. They have coexisted in this city for decades, with very few incidents of religious violence. The residents now say these protests are disrupting the prevailing peace, with the protesters trying to divide the community on religious lines. Some say Muslim radical groups are stoking tensions. Others say certain Hindu youths are causing the trouble. Both agree that the tension started with the cricket match, and this has made leaders from both communities issue joint statements to end the violence. They are appealing to the youth that they must cease the provocations, both in thought and behavior. The chief of Leicester Police has also issued a statement saying, and I'm quoting, "We are working to keep you safe and to arrest and bring to justice those that are causing harm in our communities." So at the end of the day, what's playing out in Leicester does not have the support of the city's residents, but the city's youth are refusing to let go of the animosity. And shifting focus now to the United States, what happens there now also could have an impact on the entire world. The U.S. Federal Reserve has announced another interest hike. Analysts were split between 75 and 100 basis points, but in the end, the Fed went with the former, 75 basis points. And with this hike, a couple of things are clear. Number one, this cycle of monetary tightening is not ending soon. What does that mean? It basically means there could be similar hikes in the future. The Fed is not interested in half measures. It wants complete victory over the rising prices. Listen to this.
My colleagues and I are strongly committed to bringing inflation back down to our 2% goal. We have both the tools we need and the resolve that it will take to restore price stability on behalf of American families and businesses. Price stability is the responsibility of the Federal Reserve and serves as the bedrock of our economy.
Number two, what will the impact be of this rate hike? Before answering that, let me give you some context. This was the third consecutive 75 basis point hike by the Federal Reserve. Simply put, loans are now more expensive. Now, just to be clear here, that is precisely the idea behind raising interest rates. Less borrowing means less spending, and less spending equals lower inflation. That is how the economic theory works. But there is a downside to this strategy. If the rate hikes are too steep, it could trigger a slowdown. There will be job cuts, unemployment, and finally, a full-blown recession. Many economists fear this will happen, either by the end of this year or early next year. Whether it happens or not depends on what the Fed is thinking. And right now, they have hinted at more hikes. They want to increase the lending rate to 4.4% by the end of this year and to 4.6% by 2023. If that happens, all bets are off. Listen to what the Fed chairman had to say about the looming recession.
And we don't know. No one knows whether this process will lead to a recession, or if so, how significant that recession would be.
Not exactly inspiring, is it? In fact, most central banks around the world are following the same strategy. They are hiking interest to control inflation. The Bank of England announced a 50 basis point hike today. The Swiss National Bank, 75 basis points. It is their largest ever interest hike. Switzerland's benchmark rates were minus 0.25%, now standing at 0.5%. Norway's central bank raised the key rates by 50 basis points. It is at the highest level since 2011. Vietnam increased interest rates by 100 basis points. Indonesia by 50 basis points. So most central bankers are thinking along the same lines. They are willing to risk a recession to battle inflation. How exactly are the markets reacting to this move? Well, the Fed's decision was not exactly surprising, so the markets had already factored in the rate hike. Yet, most of them closed in the red. Let me give you a quick roundup. Dow Jones closed 1.7% down. Britain's FTSE closed 0.3% down. The German DAX 1%. The Asian markets also lost some of the gains. India's Sensex closed 0.57% down. Japan's Nikkei 0.58% and the Hang Seng 1.6%. So clearly a bad day for global markets. The question is, could it get worse? When there is fear of recession, investors are wary of volatile assets, things like stocks and cryptocurrencies. So they abandon these forms of investments and instead they prefer safer options like government bonds. And if that happens, there could be an exodus of capital from the markets, especially emerging markets. And this is a major worry for India as well. The Reserve Bank of India's next policy announcement is due this month itself. Most experts agree there will be a hike. The question is, by how much? They are split between 35 basis points and 50 basis points. Morgan Stanley believing the RBI will go with 50 basis points. If so, it could hamper India's growth. Like all countries, India also has two considerations. A, tackling inflation, and B, securing growth. In the last quarter, India's GDP grew at 13.5%. It was higher than most major economies. At the same time, it was lower than the RBI's prediction. What does that mean? There are already indications of a slowdown. And if the RBI keeps hiking the interest rates, there could be a recession. At the same time, they cannot ignore inflation. It is the RBI's legal duty to maintain price stability. If the inflation target is breached for 9 months, the RBI must explain itself to the government. And on that front, things are not looking good. Consumer prices dropped in July, but they rose to 7% in the month of August. So now may not be the time to let off. We have talked about moonlighting repeatedly on this show. It has become a lightning rod recently. But now we are hearing reports of the first casualties. Indian IT giant Wipro has fired 300 employees for moonlighting. The company says they were working for other employers, including Wipro's competitors. We will discuss the events leading up to their termination, but we also look at the bigger picture here. Doing one job is hard enough. Why are people eager to do two? And what does it say about India's IT industry? Our next report telling you.
On August 20th, Wipro chairman Rishad Premji tweeted this: "A lot of chatter about people moonlighting in the tech industry. This is cheating, plain and simple." Turns out he was dead serious. Premji has revealed that he fired 300 employees for moonlighting. First things first, what exactly is moonlighting? It is the practice of having two jobs at once, like a school teacher doubling up as a tutor. Classic example of moonlighting. But Indian companies are not excited about it. IT giants like Infosys and Wipro have made their position clear. If we catch you moonlighting, you are in trouble. Which raises an important question. How did Wipro catch these moonlighters? Reports say through their Universal Account Number, or UAN. Employees in the unorganized sector are assigned their own 12-digit UAN. It tells you about their past employment, also where they are working currently. The UAN can be accessed from the Provident Fund organization. Wipro is said to have discovered this during their annual audit in July. Some employees were working for their competitors, like Infosys and Tech Mahindra. So Wipro's Human Resource Department pulled up these employees. Some resigned voluntarily, others were fired. The question is, was this legal? The Indian law doesn't explicitly ban moonlighting, but chances are your job contract does. Most companies do not like their employees working elsewhere, especially for a competitor. So their contracts clearly ban moonlighting. But what is the root cause of this side hustle culture? Why are people moonlighting in the first place? Perhaps because their primary job isn't enough. If that wasn't always the case in India, the Indian IT sector was once the ticket to prosperity. You land a job in Infosys or TCS and you were sorted for life. So, what changed? Experts say the salaries are not competitive anymore. Employees are judged based on how long they are in office. Their work is weighted by their in-time and out-time. So, naturally, they look elsewhere. Perhaps a better option would be to compensate based on merit. Better output, better salary. So, this Wipro layoff is a lesson for both employees and employers. Neither side can take anything for granted. If companies want good workers, they must pay them well. And if workers want a side hustle, they cannot sidestep their contract. Because if they do, they could lose their main hustle. Bureau Report, WION. World is One.
There is a growing risk of a nuclear war. The global economy is heading for a recession. Workers are fighting for their basic rights. Amid all these global issues, New Zealand is fighting for something very basic. It is fighting for the use of simple language. The New Zealand Parliament is debating a bill that mandates bureaucrats to use simple, understandable language in official communications. Our next report telling you more.
What would you understand better? Runneth thither is a devouring inferno, or run, there is a fire. When it comes to critical communication, simple language is always a better idea. But simple language is not so simple to find. Instead, you may often find yourself reading and rereading government communication, or a court judgment, scratching your head and trying to figure out what it actually means. New Zealand is trying to make matters simple. It is pushing for a simple language bill. The idea is to have straightforward language in official communications. A plain language bill is currently before the New Zealand Parliament. It was presented by a Labour Party parliamentarian, and it has seen some colourful debates. Recently, parliamentarian Sarah Pallett read out Wordsworth to the House. I wandered lonely as a cloud, she began, that floats on high over vales and hills, when all at once I saw a crowd, a host of golden daffodils. Beautiful, she remarked, adding, Basically, I was feeling sad, I went for a walk, I saw a lot of beautiful daffodils, and they cheered me right up. Good old Wordsworth. But that is the place for flowery, inaccessible language, in poetry and literature, and not in government legislation. New Zealand's opposition is not convinced. One parliamentarian called it the stupidest bill to come before Parliament. Its supporters, though, are standing firm. Their argument is simple. They say people must understand what their government is trying to say. People must understand government policy. Legal notices, critical communication should not be lost in complicated language. It's a fair point. And New Zealand isn't the first to raise it. Plain language movements originated in the 1970s. The UK, the US, and Canada pushed for simplicity. One school of thought said plain language means accountability. Another said plain language means inclusivity. Minority communities, migrants, and marginalized communities often struggle to understand jargon-laden, complicated Victorian English. In 2010, the US passed the Plain Writing Act. It required federal agencies to communicate clearly. Ironically, though, the Kiwi Bill does not define plain language. All it says is that the language must be clear, concise, and well organized. So what really is plain language? Honestly, it's subjective. Totally depends on who you ask, and what is the person's level of indulgence in the English language. Broadly, though, plain language means shorter sentences, simple acronyms, and shunning passive verbs. So the first task before New Zealand will be to define plain language. Then it must also look beyond the jargon. The current bill does not propose that official documents be published in languages other than English. Say Te Reo Maori. Point number 3. The bill does not clearly say how plain language will be implemented. So to sum it up, and to put it simply, while the push for simplicity is great and a much-needed move, it must also be implementable. Bureau Report, WION, World is One.
Let's now tell you what else made news. Time for Gravitas Global Headlines.
Iran blocks access to social media websites and imposes drastic restrictions on internet access as anti-hijab protests intensify, taking the death toll to 11. Meanwhile, at least 31 were killed in the crackdown by Iranian security forces, according to an Oslo-based Iran human rights NGO. North Korea denies it is providing arms to Russia just weeks after the United States said Moscow was turning to Pyongyang to replenish its arsenal. Former Justice Minister of China Fu Shenghua faces life in prison after a court handed him a suspended death sentence for accepting bribes. Islamabad High Court defers contempt proceedings against PTI chairman Imran Khan after he expressed willingness to apologize for his remarks against a sitting judge. Hundreds of people protested at anti-monarchy rallies across Australia as the country observed a national day of mourning for the late Queen Elizabeth II. A 6.8 magnitude earthquake strikes western Mexico, leaving a woman dead as she fell and hit her head as residents evacuated their homes during the country's second major quake this week. Australia has managed to refloat 32 of the 35 stranded whales that remained alive as 200 pilot whales die after being stranded at a Tasmanian beach. Taiwan will fully reopen its borders by ending mandatory COVID quarantine for arrivals starting from next month. Roger Federer's final match will see him team up with his great rival Rafael Nadal in the Laver Cup. The pair will represent Team Europe and they will take on Team World's Jack Sock and Frances Tiafoe. India captain Harmanpreet Kaur hit an unbeaten 143, while pacer Renuka Singh Thakur scalped 4 wickets as India beat England by 88 runs in the second one-day international to win their first ODI series in England since 1999.
With that, it's a wrap on this edition of Gravitas, leaving you with Gravitas images. Thanks very much for watching.
And if you guys can just twist slightly so you're facing the trophy.
Sorry.
Right, we're good.